According to Amnesty International, two-thirds of countries in the world have either abolished capital punishment outright or no longer use it in practice. After more than 400 years, Virginia became the 23rd state and the first state of the former Confederacy to ban the death penalty. Dr. Frank Baumgartner, Richard J. Richardson Distinguished Professor of Political Science in the College of Arts and Sciences at UNC Chapel Hill, is an expert and an award-winning author on the subject. His other work related to the death penalty nationally focuses on rates of reversal, geographic concentration, and issues of innocence. Dr. Baumgartner, thank you so much for sharing some time with us today.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Throughout history, capital punishment has swung in and out of favor in the U.S. So, what are the forces and the factors that contribute to shifts in public opinion, and where is that popular opinion at right now?
Well, I won't take the time to go back through all of American history back to colonial times. The first execution was in 1608, so that's quite a long history. But in the modern times, the death penalty had become very unpopular by the 1960s. And in fact, in 1965, the Gallup poll showed more people opposing the death penalty than supporting it in 1965. In 1972, the Supreme Court ruled the existing death penalty laws to be unconstitutional because the justices said the separation between those who got death and those who did not was like being struck by lightning. It was capricious and arbitrary. It was a very small number of people would get the death penalty, and you couldn't really tell why. And then they also said if there was a reason, it may have been the reason of race. So they invalidated everything existing, all the inmates on death row, which I think there were 700 at the time. They were all converted to life in prison, including the killer of Robert Kennedy, Sirhan Sirhan, and some other notable people who were on death row in 1972. The reaction to that was swift throughout the country and especially in the southern states. And very, very quickly, states reenacted new death penalty laws that were designed to fulfill the promise and to avoid the problems that the justices had identified. Florida actually was so quick that they had a new death penalty law in place by the end of the year in 1972. So that shows their motivation. They really wanted to get it going. North Carolina and several other states said, well, if the justices believe that this is capricious and arbitrary and potentially racist, we'll make it mandatory. And they made the death penalty mandatory for eligible crimes. And the justices ruled that that was unconstitutional. It had to be individually decided which particular killers deserved death. In any case, public opinion moved in favor of the death penalty, and the use of the death penalty expanded and rose and got bigger and bigger until about 1995, 1996. So for about 20 years, from the mid-70s to the mid-90s, opinion moved in the direction of harshness. Around the mid-90s, things changed, and since the mid-1990s, we've been on a trajectory towards less and less use of the death penalty. One of the things that drove that was the problem of innocence. The idea that perhaps you can't trust the government to do things perfectly. Perhaps there's times when the government will make mistakes. And perhaps in these highly emotional trials where there's always, a really terrible crime, any homicide is, I think, a terrible crime, but these are all cases of homicide, and many of them terrible homicides with multiple victims or torture, highly emotional cases. What's the odds that we'll have a 100% accuracy rate? We'll never make a mistake. What's the odds that we'll never execute an innocent person in a system run by the government and in a highly charged atmosphere with a lot of anger and emotion? And I think, and where, up to now, we've executed over 1,500 individuals, and we've sentenced almost 9,000 people to death since 1976. So what are the odds that every one of those decisions was accurate? I think everybody recognizes, and if they don't, we can tell them that over 165 people have been found to be innocent after having been sentenced to death. So I think the innocence argument shook people's confidence in the death penalty, and it's causing states to abolish, as Virginia did recently.
Well, Virginia was actually a leader in capital punishment. I think it was 113 people executed since 1973. How significant is this decision in Virginia to abolish the death penalty?
It's very significant. The other states that have recently abolished, of which there are several, mostly were not big players in the death penalty system. New Jersey, New Mexico, Colorado, Washington State. Those states have recently abolished. I would point to a counter example would be the state of Illinois, which also has abolished, but they were a big player, but that's a northern state. And the state of Illinois had its confidence shaken to the roots because of some terrible examples of police torture and extracting false confessions out of young men on the south side of Chicago in the 1980s and 90s. So their governor commuted the sentences of everyone on death row several years ago, over a decade ago, Governor Ryan. And then later, the state abolished the death penalty. So Illinois was a big player in the death penalty world, but it's a northern state and it had a particular explanation. Virginia was one of the biggest historical users of the death penalty, and in recent times also the second leading executing state behind Texas and ahead of Oklahoma. So it's a big thing. And it's a southern state. It's the capital of the Confederacy. So and the death penalty is very much a southern phenomenon in today's world.
Well, you are writing a book right now on race and capital punishment in North Carolina, focusing on the decline of the death penalty there, but its potent racial symbolism throughout history. Does Virginia's move provide momentum for North Carolina and other states to follow suit?
I think when a state like Virginia comes to an official recognition that the system is not helpful for public safety, that we can live without it, that we can protect our citizens with harsh punishments for people who commit terrible crimes, but where we can also recognize that the death penalty creates its own problems. It establishes two categories of victims: deserving victims and potentially less deserving victims, where the killers of this victim or this group of people are more likely to get the death penalty, and the killers of some other kinds of people, namely Black and minority victims, are less likely to see the state seek to execute the perpetrator. There's no reason why we need to create those two classes of victims. Every homicide victim is precious, and every family who suffers the loss in a homicide of a loved one would want the government to, find that perpetrator and put them away. And many of us would want them to do more than that. But still, the death penalty, I think when Virginia shows that they can live without it, when they have the political courage to decide that it's got racist roots, the death penalty is linked to historical patterns of lynchings. The death penalty is vastly more likely to be used when the victim is a white female than when the victim is a Black male. Homicide victimization rates are high in the Black community, but when Blacks are the victims, the use of the death penalty is lower. So it can't be used as a deterrent if we're not using it in the area where it's most common. But where it's really used is in that special and very unusual case where there's cross-racial crimes, where Black perpetrators kill white victims, but it's not used when white victims kill Black. When white perpetrators have Black victims, we rarely use the death penalty in those cases. So there's terrible racial dynamics that are consistent with the ugliest patterns of slavery and lynching and the most uncomfortable elements of American history. So it's a historical relic.
So, What are considered capital crimes in the US? And what does the research say about deterrence? Is there any evidence whatsoever that the death penalty has an impact on reducing crime?
Well, each state sets its own laws about whether it's going to have a death penalty, and if it does have a death penalty, which crimes will make a criminal eligible for the death penalty. The most common pattern is that it's supposed to be reserved for the worst crimes, but what happens is legislators don't want to miss any, so they don't want to write a law that's too narrowly targeted. In some states, they do write very narrowly targeted laws that only somebody who's already in prison serving a life sentence, and then they kill another inmate or they kill a guard or a corrections officer in the prison, they would be eligible, because if they're not eligible, there's no additional punishment they could get because they're already sentenced to life without parole, for example. Or killing a police officer is almost always killing a police officer in the line of duty, or killing a judge, or killing somebody in law enforcement. But many states can't stop themselves from adding something like this, or any other crime that manifests exceptional depravity of mind, or any other crime, any crime that is committed in an especially heinous and cruel manner. And once we add in those perhaps well-meaning clauses to the law, what it opens up is the vast discretion of the district attorney to decide to pick and choose which particular homicides were especially heinous and cruel. And that opens up to the discretion, and that high level of discretion leads to the disparities that we've often seen. And it's either racially driven disparities, or it's the kind that the justices noticed back in 1972, saying that it's like being hit by lightning. There's no rhyme or reason to it. The same crime in Harris County, Texas leads to a death penalty, and that same crime in Atlanta, Georgia does not, just because the prosecutors in the two different communities have chosen different ways to interpret especially heinous and cruel. So the states have different laws. It's very common that there be some kind of what we call a vague aggravator that gives a lot of discretion to the district attorney. Or they say, as many states do, including North Carolina, that any homicide that occurs during the commission of a felony is death eligible. So that means every 7-Eleven robbery that goes bad becomes death eligible. And not only is the gun wielding perpetrator, the so-called trigger man, open to the death penalty, but so is the getaway car driver. Because if you participate in a felony during which a homicide occurs, you've committed capital murder. So, and there have been more than 15 people actually executed who did not commit the homicide. They participated in the underlying felony, and they've been executed for those crimes. And one of the recent federal cases was a person who was not a trigger man. I can't remember if he was a getaway driver or somebody who helped plan the crime, but he was not, and was not alleged to be, the person who actually pulled the trigger and killed the victim. So that's a long answer. I mean, the answer is in a federal system, the states pick, the states write the criminal justice laws, and every state has a different stance on the death penalty. But all the states are moving away from it. And Virginia is the first major big death penalty using state in the South to abolish, and I think it will not be the last.
Well, given the numbers of people found innocent, it's a move in the right direction. Dr. Baumgartner, thank you so much for sharing your expertise on this ever-evolving topic. We look forward to the release of your new book, A Deadly Symbol, Race and Capital Punishment in North Carolina.
Thanks very much for having me. I'm glad you're interested in this topic. It's a very important one.